Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jason Whitehead. I'm one of your co-hosts for the Jason's Take On. And today we're going to be talking about getting customer onboarding right. We're also going to be talking quite a bit about driving adoption and how to really make sure that your projects are successful. As we go through, please feel free to type in any questions into the Q&A window, and we will go ahead and answer them at the end of the webinar, but you don't need to wait. We love questions and love to get to as many as we can. So anything that comes to mind, please just go ahead and type it in the box. And I also wanted to let you know that this is also now a podcast. So we're recording this session and it will be made available on the Jason's Take On website. You'll see links to all the different podcast sites. So if you're into podcasts or know people who are, please go ahead and check it out there. With that as a background, let me go ahead and turn this over to my co-host, Jason Noble, who will kick us off. Jason?
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Noble, co-hosting here with Jason for this series of webinars. What I really just want to talk through is why are we doing this? Why this series? Jason and I have known each other for a year or so and have come into know each other through customer success leadership and the community around that. We're both super passionate about customer success. We see the big value and growing value that it's giving to the business, but we also see lots of challenges that different organizations are having as to where CS fits in, where leadership fits in, and all the different topics. And what we've gone through a series of conversations that we've had is current with a series of webinars that we're going to, as Jason said, going to do as podcasts. We will do blogs as well, talking about them, but talking through the different challenges. And really, this is us helping people think differently, kind of advance in their careers, but giving back. I think there's a great community around customer success. It is so collaborative, and really, this is us sharing our learnings. Something that we thought about the other day as well. The term the Jasons. There is actually, if you Google it. There is a book called The Jasons, which is nothing to do with customer success. But when you look into where that name came from, one of the reasonings they talk about is that the term Jason was borrowed from the Greek mythology of Jason, the Golden Fleece. And that's sometimes the interpretation of the story there was of a hero's search for a magical tool to bring prosperity and kinship. Now, what Jason and I are not offering you is a magical tool. But by listening to our conversations, our experiences, kind of the action, as Jason said, the be bold side of it, there will be pieces there that hopefully you can take back and apply to your organizations and drive better value and outcomes from your customers. Quick intro to myself. So I'm Jason Noble. I'm based in the UK, as you can tell from the accent. I've been in the technology space for a good number of years now, working in customer focused roles. So I've done leadership around customer support, customer service delivery, account management, program management, and now into customer success. And I think that experience in all the customer facing roles has really given me a great insight into how it works and how customer success needs to drive what organizations are delivering to their customers. I've worked with big brands like Sony, but also with niche technology players, and most recently headed up the customer success function for a prop tech startup in London called Goodlord. Jason, over to you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Whitehead, based here in Washington, D.C. My background includes many years working hands-on doing technology implementations, but for about the past 20 years, I've been really focused on helping organizations drive adoption and value and make sure that they're actually getting the business outcomes that they want from their technology investment. I've spent many years working with all different shapes and sizes of organizations, from large to small and in all different industries. And where I get really excited and really passionate is really helping people figure out how to introduce technology in a new way and in a better way that really gets people to embrace it and to start to incorporate it into their daily jobs faster and easier so that everyone benefits from it. So I'm really excited about this topic, and I've had a great time working with Jason to get started for this. But as you know, if you're a regular listener, one of the things we like to try and issue right up front and want everyone to think about, and please go ahead and type it into some comments or questions if you have them, what our big bold challenge, and what bold action can you take to really be bold and different about how you change the way you fundamentally rethink your customers, rethink how you engage with your customers to drive their adoption and to drive their success during the onboarding process. So not just making small changes, but what are some fundamental differences and new approaches that you can take to really increase the effectiveness of adoption and onboarding and get things moving. So as we go through the discussion today, please keep that in mind of what you can do, because it's really important to make some bold efforts here. And we're really excited about that. So with that as a starting point, Jason, why don't you go ahead and tell us what is the big challenge that we're seeing regarding adoption onboarding, and sort of set the stage for us here.
I think it's a great starting question and a huge one. And you and I kind of bounced a number of ideas and conversations of this yesterday and last week. And I think it is that the adoption and onboarding piece is really that first critical step when the customer's been sold the promise of what you can deliver, and they're now starting to see it come into reality. So it's a huge moment for the customers. And I think that there is a bigger expectation of the level of experience, the level of service that we have to deliver. Customers' expectations, they want to go live and get the value from the products really, really quickly. So there's almost an impatience there. Quite often, some of the customers that you speak to, they're not the same people that will have bought the product. They're not the stakeholders that have signed off. They're not the budget holders. These are actually the users involved in it. And I think one other really key thing is that there was a article that I read a couple of days back that said back in 2007, this was looking just at MarTech, there was something like 150 MarTech organizations. And if you fast forward to 2018, there are something like 7,000. That jump in number of providers, technology providers, is scary. That there are a lot of problems that organizations are trying to start, but are trying to solve rather. But it really shows there's a huge appetite for technology and what it can do. But at the same time, people's expectations as to what technology is going to deliver have massively shifted. And people have huge expectations. And we've talked before about our experiences and expectations as consumers and how we're driven by experiences like Netflix, like Amazon, like Spotify, and that relates to us as business users. So that's a really big challenge. So I think the expectations are one of the big things. There are very, very, very high expectations. The other thing, as I mentioned briefly, is impatience. I think people do, you're looking at trying to change the way they work, change their day jobs potentially. So there's an impatience. They want to see that value very quickly. Some people can perceive it as risk. If you're trying to automate a lot of their work, they may feel threatened by it. So there's another huge challenge there. And I think the other thing is that there is this drive to push more value to customers, and actually to get that value isn't just about the go live, as we'll talk about in a bit, but it's about that time to value and how you see that. And I think that you've got a whole mix of time to value, go live times. You've got the different technologies, different stakeholders. Organizations themselves are going through massive periods of change right now. There's a lot of organizations that are shifting their business models, moving from legacy organizations to cloud to digital. There's a lot of change in organizations. So it really feeds into how critical that onboarding and adoption piece is. And I said right at the beginning, it is for many customers that initial step in the customer journey. I like you, Jason, the customer journey for us really starts in the pre-sale stage. It doesn't start here. But for our customers, this is really when they want to start seeing that promise of what they've been sold by sales, the vision of what the product can deliver. They want to see it. So those expectations are really big. I don't know if there's anything you'd add there to that, Jason.
I think you really hit the nail on the head. The only other thing that really pops to mind too, when you're talking about this constant change or the change that's constant too, and new systems are constantly coming in, not just the one that you're implementing, but that new releases are coming in. So it's really that ongoing need to really embrace technology and to adopt it and to figure out what that's going. And even you could almost look at how do you onboard at every release and making sure that's going as well too, to quickly get that value from the new feature, to quickly make people understand it. So it is that relentless, never-ending requirement that's there.
I think that's the key thing, and that kind of leads on to the next question, which I'll pose back to you. Is a lot of this just isn't about user change and adoption. It's actually about organizational level change. So how do we present the case as part of the adoption, the implementation, even the sale process? How do we present the case for a different approach and the need for organizational level change?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I want to share with everyone. We don't normally do slides on this presentation, but I want to share something real quick. And I do have a couple of YouTube videos to explain this in more detail. But every time I've walked an executive, whether it's someone who's buying software or a SaaS vendor, through this quick little model, they instantly understand the need to rethink how they're approaching onboarding and adoption, and really how they need to shift it to have a bigger impact. And what we typically look at is, when you're first moving out here, you've got project begins, and at the very beginning, it's like at some point in the future, we'll solve a business problem, through technology, and we'll get some great return on investment, some great benefits, and those can be whatever your definition of success is. It can be more revenue, lower costs. If you're, nonprofits and government agency, it can be, lower cost to serve or faster time or to conduct work or improve reach, whatever it may be. But the expectation is that at some point in the future, as a result of this technology, we'll be better off as an organization. And in a perfect world, it would just be a straight line and we go right there. But in reality, what typically happens is organizations spend a lot of time and effort, just working from the left side of the timeline over to the right, coming up with requirements. What do we need the system to do? Looking at different software packages, negotiating contracts or doing an RFP, getting requirements and designing and configuring and testing and building. And then at one point they go live, and that's great. But when you look at the effort that's been put in there and the expense, time and money and real dollars, really what they've done at go live is typically they've maximized their sunk costs. And well, at least you hope they have. And sometimes it's not the case either. And what we typically see is this when we do what I call traditional change management. It starts a little bit before go live and sort of covers right around the go live period. And typically that's really just focused on, training people how to navigate the system, where to go, and a little change management sort of, communicating to them. The big one is always the what's in it for me message, which I find highly ineffective, but we'll cover that another day. And then most projects just stop here. And when I ask executives and buyers and sellers, is this what you typically see? I always get the head nod that, yep, this is where it is. And then we say, and what typically happens next? And when they look at it just laid out like this, like, oh, we're nowhere near over where our success goal is, our that green target. But there's a huge success gap here. And when you say, well, is it any wonder that you're not getting value and you're not getting it fast enough? What typically happens here? Like, oh, usually it goes over to the support organization, and it's their job to go and just provide support as customers have questions, but we don't actually proactively do anything to drive that success. And that's a real red flag and a danger zone. So if that's the approach that you're taking, this is an opportunity to be bold and start to think about it. Because what starts to happen then is, as you look what happens next, is slowly you'll get some people to adopt the system, and they'll start to get some value, but maybe not enough. And if it's just a couple people, you'll slowly come up this yellow curve, and you recover some of your costs, but you may not recover all of them. And only as you get large groups of people, lots of individuals and teams using the system effectively and collaborating effectively using the tool, departments, divisions, all of it, and working well within the tool and working and collaborating effectively, that's how you climb back up that recovery cost and start to get the value that you need just to break even. And at some point in the future, if you're lucky, you break even. Though, in my experience, if you're not doing things to proactively drive adoption all the way through this period, that break-even period happens much farther out than people were expecting in their business case. And then eventually, if you're lucky, at some point you'll actually achieve the benefits that you wanted, and success will happen. But typically, the level of success that organizations achieve is much lower than expected, and it happens much later in the game. And it's really interesting just to see, like, you haven't done anything after go live to really drive this adoption and to drive this value and to keep it going year after year after year. Of course, you're going to have some problems. So if this is the approach that you're taking, where you focus on just getting it live, and most IT organizations, they're rewarded and incentivized on time and on budget delivery. It's not normally their role or their job to make sure adoption and value creation happens afterwards. And if you ask, well, whose job is it, and you don't get an answer, that's a real red flag right there. Okay, so let me come back here real quick. So apologies for that. So here's the success curve. You spend a lot of time and effort on sunk costs, and if you've stopped here, and normally when I'm asking organizations about this, I pause and ask them their experience right here, and they'll say, yeah, this is what we typically do, and where it typically goes wrong, we've got a huge success gap. We slowly get some value, and we come back up, and then as we go through, eventually we'll hit that success that we wanted. And that's, really important to recognize that success happens so much later than most people expect, and it tends to be much lower than people expect. And then the real question becomes, what happens next? Like, if you forecast out 5-10 years in the future, if you don't have an infrastructure in place to drive ongoing adoption, as turnover happens in your organization, as you have new functionality coming out, as have new pressures for your business, suddenly you're right back down here, and you've lost all the value you created. And as I tell people, the value you get on your IT investments, just like any other investment, it can be up one year and down the next. You've got to constantly be focusing on that value creation. Instead, what you want to do is say, how do we make sure that, we keep the value creation going year over year over year? And when you start to ask organizations about how they're going to do this, about the infrastructure they have in place to drive the success post go live, typically they're like, oh, we don't do that. We don't know how to do that. No one's ever told us to do that. And they're really clamoring for help with that. So if you're the buyer of software, you need to be thinking about how to do this internally. And if you're a customer success professional, you need to start to think, how do you educate your customers about the need for this and the impact if they don't do it on their success and what it takes to get there? So that's really, as we say, why do you focus so much value and time and effort on the cost side and what happens before go live, instead of all this time where the value is created? And when you look at it from an implementation standpoint, if it takes a couple of weeks to a couple of months to get a system live, but you expect to have it 5-10 years in the future, there's so much more value to be created on the right side of this curve. More of your efforts really need to be focused there. So those are just some of the ways that we found very helpful to explain to executives, let's think about this. Let's come up with a new approach, because there's really big gaps in most of our methodologies around this, and they've been there for a very, very long time. So, Jason, what are your thoughts on that? Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, there is, and as we spoke yesterday, Jason, I love these diagrams, and I think too many organizations, and I've been there myself. I've been a project manager. I've run teams of project managers. The big focus for a lot of organizations is just that go live milestone, and a lot of people working with a traditional mindset, they almost move on to the next thing once you've gone live, and that's it, finished. That your engagement with the organization finishes, this is where adoption and the role of customer success really comes into its own. And there is, organizations spend money getting to that go live. There's a cost there, and I think until you can articulate it like you've done here, a lot of people almost don't realize it. And when you're sold a solution technology, nobody focuses on the challenge to go live and the cost there. There's what the focus is on, the benefits and the ROI, but there's that bit at the beginning that no one's talking about. And there's a huge level of change management that's needed within an organization to do it. And do they have the resources to do that? How do they skill themselves to do it? What's your role as a vendor and a provider in change management? And bear in mind, you said it earlier on, Jason, that we typically as technology providers are one piece in their value chain, and there are many other providers. Do we have a perception and an idea of what that big picture looks like and where we fit in, and who's managing that overall change program?
Right. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And this simple chart right here that really helps get people thinking, that triggers a different conversation with them. The other thing to remember is, as your customers, they're looking at the same situation across their entire portfolio of every software they're investing in. So they're also looking at, how do we get value from this system, but from all the other ones in which we've invested. And they're going to start to say, how are your services going to help us achieve more than some other vendor? And they're just going to start to compare people a bit more. But I think with that as a backdrop, Jason, what can you tell us about onboarding customer organizations versus onboarding a user population?
I think it's another great question, and that a lot of the focus traditionally, and I think still for organizations, is on onboarding the user population. And when you kick off your onboarding process, I've run teams of implementation consultants. You typically have your users on those calls, or maybe a champion user. Who's not on the call is often your stakeholder that's bought into your solution. And typically that more senior person or group of people are more responsible for organizational level change and onboarding the organization. So there's two very different things, and the focus, as I said, is always on, or traditionally on the user side of it. So I think what you've got to do is shift that focus, and you as a provider and technology organization, and as a customer success professional leader, start the conversation talking about organizational onboarding, organizational change, and get the buy-in and commitment from the customer that this is more than just one piece of technology coming in. Get them to understand the potential impact, the outcomes that they want, articulate those business outcomes, the business value that you're getting from it in such a way that they can see it rather than at the user level. And I think as part of this, it's so important to have your senior stakeholders who on that initial onboarding call. We talked in our last webinar about having sales guys on the onboarding call to start with. Have some time from your senior stakeholders just so that they can set the stage. You want the rest of their users that you're doing the onboarding sessions with to understand that this is company wide. There is a reason they're doing this, and there is a big organizational change, and actually you as a user play a part in that, and you're actually going through a big shift. So I think it's so important. I think what you want to do as part of that buy-in and getting them to agree that there is an organizational change there and what's needed is how do they then commit to providing their own resources to doing that? You know, your diagram there and graphs, there's a lot of focus that people put on us as the technology providers on the onboarding and the implementation. We provide the resources, but who on the customer side is their effective program manager for making sure your piece of technology goes through successfully, that it hits all the outcomes. You talked about the success plan earlier, the success goals, the success outcomes. Hey, how do you know you're hitting those? So do organizations have the expertise and capacity? And this quite often can be a blocker. You know, when we sell our solutions, you don't want to introduce other blockers and say, well, you need your own program manager, you need your own change manager. And some of those are very, very specialist skills, but you've got to make sure that they understand it at the very least. And if they don't have the resources there, what can you do to supplement that? And I think once you've got through and understood about the organizational level change, and there is that buy-in there, you've talked around expertise, around capacity, the focus then can be more on the actual users. And quite often when I've sat on or run onboarding calls, or my team have, the stakeholders, the senior stakeholders may leave after initial intro, and the more detailed bit when you're doing the actual user population, you can then focus on it. So I think it's important to split the session out into two parts, where you're talking about stakeholders, the more organizational level, to get the organizational wide buy-in, but then absolutely focus then on actually the users, the people who you're expecting to use your services, your technology on a day-to-day basis and change how they're working. So there is a change management piece there, but I think there's just two different parts to focus there. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you just said. And, you know, one of the things that still boggles my mind, because when we train people up on customer success and software adoption, because we work with both audiences, and we work with the buyers of software, you know, it still boggles my mind that buyers of organizations don't have their own internal success team. You know, SaaS vendors have a customer success team. Why don't your buyers have their own internal success team to ensure their own success? And we've actually helped several organizations build out these teams and build out, you know, we've called a user adoption program management office, some we've called a success team. But really the function was the same, to put in the infrastructure they need to achieve success within their own organization with the software they've purchased. And, you know, the bigger the investment in organizations making, the more important it is to have that. You know, it's interesting too, as you talk about like scaring off a vendor with the talk of the costs about all of this. You know, when we speak with vendors and they're worried about the sales process, like, you've got to point out to your potential clients here that this is not new work you're asking them to do. This is work that they should have been doing all along that they never knew they needed to do. They were very focused on getting the system out the door. They weren't focused on getting value. And many organizations really don't have expertise in that. And they don't know what it takes to make those transformations to really get the value that they want. So, you know, they cannot do the work, and then you're right in that sunk cost and that big success gap, or you can do the work and you can come up with success gap very, very quickly and get the outcomes you want. You know, the choice is yours. You know, one other tip that, you know, we found helpful is just asking people who are making the buying decision, say, you know, what level of adoption did you assume when you made the business case for this? And pretty consistently we assumed 100% adoption on day one in terms of the financial impact. And then when we ask them, well, what have you gotten on all your other systems? Then they usually get really quiet and have the red face, like, oh, nowhere near that. So it's probably not a great assumption. We need to rethink this approach. You know, and then I think the other piece, though, that you touched on with the user population, which people miss so much, is fundamentally when implementing major systems, you're not trying to make their jobs easier. You're actually fundamentally changing their jobs and what it means to be good at their job, and thinking about how they experience their work life on a day-to-day basis. And for some people, they lose prestige or skills, and for others, they gain things. And some people have the fear factor that you talked about, that it really becomes a very personal thing very, very quickly. And I think a lot of folks don't recognize that, and trying to understand how big of a transition is for the people that are expected to use it day in day, because it's not just changing a workflow, it's changing how they spend their time, how they are viewed as experts in their organization, how they communicate. And if they're not comfortable with technology, or they don't feel respected, or whatever it may be, it can be very, very challenging. So those are just a couple of other thoughts.
I think that's so key, and you've hit a couple of nails bang on there, is where we're fundamentally changing people's behavior or trying to change it. And we're one part of what they do. So they may be going through multiple changes. And it's very difficult for a lot of people. I think the other, we've talked there about organizations having their own success type team that can help manage this.
Mm-hmm.
Quite often what organizations as vendors are missing, we have an onboarding function, we have an implementation function, we may have project managers, professional services. Do we have change managers? Change management is a whole discipline in itself. And I think not enough organizations are investing the right time and expertise to build up their own expertise. So if I'm talking with my customers about changing how they're working, it's important for me to be able to present to them the levels of expertise around change management. Sorry, Jace, go on.
I was going to say, I think that's so true. And in my experience, when I first got into technology work, my background was in information systems and working hands-on with the technology. And it wasn't until I was tasked by my employer to drive adoption internally that I realized I didn't have the skills and the expertise I needed to do that. I could get a system live all day long. And I actually had to go back. In my case, I chose to go back to school to expand my expertise and to learn organization development, how to engage people and leadership and deal with all the non-technology issues and learn new techniques for that. And that allowed me to go forward very quickly. But without that skill set, I would have really struggled. Anyway, back to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you, this is kind of setting the scene for the big challenges here. And I think what a lot of there is, we talked about kind of the impatience around adoption, but are there any practical ideas, experiences that you can share as to how you'd accelerate that ultimate user adoption? What kind of things can we do to make sure the users get onboarded as quickly as they can?
Yeah, that's such a great question because, when we work with clients and we see so many similarities happening over and over again, and many times we've been brought in to actually help turn around a failed implementation. And we go and we interview users and managers and everyone else, and we just ask them, well, why didn't you use the system? And it's amazing, but many times we hear with alarming regularity, no one ever asked me to use it. They trained me on it, but they never really said, now use it, or use it every day, or use it to do this. So they didn't even know they were supposed to or that it was expected. And then we say, so one thing is ask them and set that expectation that this is now part of your job. It's not optional, that your job is not just doing the work, but it's also doing the work in a way that enables everyone else to do their work. And one other tip that we found very helpful is really mapping out specific smart adoption goals week by week, especially when the system is first launched. So in week 1, we want you to go into the system and create 5 records under the account, or go in and create 10 contact records if you're in a CRM. But setting it so that there's a very clear, this is the task we want you to use by this date. We're going to come back and look at it. And then we're also going to come back and talk with you and say, what were the challenges that you had? Were you able to do it? Where were you confused? Where was there a process issue or a system issue? But let's go through it and set goals that we can basically check the box. Did you achieve this? Yes or no? And that has made a huge difference when we've done just that. And when we do that, we make it very cumulative, where you start with the basic functionality and then layer on the more complex modules and get people over time to get building new work habits, but getting very comfortable with the technology as well. Another thing that's really key is having the supervisors and managers measure adoption and then take action, give feedback to their team. Most people don't realize that the immediate supervisor manager is really the biggest driver of adoption out there. And so many times, no one has ever told them it's their job to make sure their teams are using the system and that they're getting value from it. And many supervisors and managers, especially if they're early in their career or conflict adverse or things like that, they may not have the skills of how do I do this effectively with my team, because it doesn't have to be combative. It can be managing and setting expectations, giving feedback, giving direction. Because I take the assumption that most people and most end users, they want to be good at their job. They want to come in and say, I did a really great job, and my boss was proud of what I did. I'm proud of what I did. I did it the right way, and I see the value in it. I just need some guidance on what that is and some feedback if I'm missing the mark so that I can improve. So if you take it as a learning situation as opposed to a punitive one, you can go quite far with that. And I think another one is, really capturing sort of the value that you're getting and not just usage. If there are ways that you can employ, qualitative and quantitative measures and say, there's a success we got as a result of doing this. Let's celebrate that. And let's share what we did and let people know so they can see the progress. I think that's really important too. And then also, obviously making it visible within the organization, letting people know, here's how my team did, here's how your team did, here's how you did, escalating up to the chain to the executives to show, yeah, we're humming along, or hey, we need some help here for whatever reason. But letting everyone know is really good. a good way to do this. Just making sure people don't play political games with that information, because people can do really funky things. And then I think one of the other things that is often not done is really setting out an expectation for a time frame by which people have to embrace the new ways of working and go through the learning curve and what that needs to look like. So, an expectation might be, in the next 2 months, we need everyone to start doing this and using these 5 modules and coming up with this result. And if at the end of 2 months you're not there, well, then we have a real issue here, because now after 2 months, it's fundamentally part of your job. And now you're not doing your job. What's our recourse for that? And how do we manage that like we would any other performance issue? So giving people a time frame by which, like, here's where we can experiment, here's where we will give you help, we will have other support resources. But at some point, okay, the transition is done and now this is part of your job. So those are some of the tactical steps, and doing those in the context of a larger program is very, very effective, because it does take time to make all of that happen. Other thoughts or suggestions, Jason?
I think the only thing I was going to say, but you covered it in your very last point, was it's a program of work and a plan. And I think if you can present to your customers a kind of a project plan as to what they should be doing, when they should be doing it, what the results are, the benefits are, that's the key thing, and almost walk them through that process. But I think giving them that plan and articulating what good looks like and what the expectations are is really key.
Yeah, and in my experience, there is usually, with the new rollout, there's an initial period where it is a transition period. It takes some time, but if you do this adoption acceleration work effectively, after a short time, people get over that hump, and then it's more tweaking around the edges, and it's less work intensive. So it's not something you have to really stress about forever and ever, but you do need to pay attention to it. But I think that really brings the question on, what is driving all this new focus on change management, and why now?
Yeah, I don't. It's an interesting one when we were talking about this. Why the focus now? I think the focus has always been there. It's always been a challenge, but as I said earlier on, just the volume and frequency of new solutions and services and vendors of technology solutions, and the rate of change is just accelerating. And I think there's a bigger need for it. And what you're finding is, given all these different vendors and providers of solutions in the different parts of the value chain, they have different stakeholders within an organization. It's not just one person. It could be your marketing team. It could be your technology team. It could be your customer success team. It could be your sales team. It could be your operations team. And quite often there's no collaboration there. We're looking at these people as individual stakeholders that we need to sell to. And I think there's nobody focusing anymore on what the big picture is. So there's lots of people selling services at small areas of focus. So there's no one looking at that big picture area as to what's the business change? How do all of these different solutions and services fit together in the company's value chain? And what do they deliver at the end of it? And what particular outcomes and challenges, what outcomes can they deliver? What challenges do they resolve? And I think you look at typically change efforts when you're working with organizations, with vendors, their efforts are treated as kind of one-off change events focused at the go live. And you said it earlier on, Jason, when I as a provider of solutions and services, there are updates and new releases coming from me. Each one of those is a change. So the implementation and adoption of one technology is an ongoing program. So it's actually multiple continuous change that's happening. And I think the other thing is that there are external change events happening. So there are constant turnover of staff, both your stakeholders, the number of times when I've seen my champion leave in an organization, and I was only talking today with someone about that. What do you do? But that happens. There are people on your side, kind of your key members of staff leaving, new pieces of software. There are external events that can be regulation changes, market changes, economic changes, really big things there. But also you've got to kind of have that mindset that change is now ongoing and it's constant, and it really isn't going to stop. And it can at times be quite scary. We've talked about the fear side of it before, but it is an adoption itself. It's that adoption to ongoing change. I think we have a great quote here. I think this is one of yours, Jason, is that SaaS software, so when we've been looking at SaaS services, that they've turned a learning curve into a learning treadmill. So it's constantly ongoing. And when services and vendors release new features, new products, how do I make sure my customers are getting the new outcomes that they want from this? They're getting the new expectations. How do I keep delivering that? And that there's a need then for someone to be focused on that change within an organization. And we talked in the last question, but where is that resource? Who helps organizations do this? Quite often organizations don't have that. And they need someone to focus on that change. You know, ultimately, it's a responsibility of the board, the CEO, but how do they make sure that change propagates throughout the organization and is successful? I think there's bigger visibility of that. So I think organizations do need somebody internally who understands organizational change, organizational development. And right now, it's a gap. Lots of organizations don't have it, or they just don't value it. And I think what organizations have historically done is seen change management as a strategic function. It's part of their strategic planning at the exec level. And what's not, the time isn't spent doing is how do you filter that change, cascade it down so it gets executed at the whole organizational level and throughout the organization, and start thinking about what this strategic business level organizational change means for our business processes, our tools, our technology, and ultimately our users. You know, there's a lot of great conversations and posts I've read recently about kind of the businesses are successful when their users and employees are successful. So how do you make your own team successful and get them bought into these changes? Anything else that you'd add to that?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head there. And, you know, a couple of things that I always come back to, which is so important with customer success, is remember, this is about achieving a business outcome, and the renewals are based on value and outcomes. And when you look at you know, the critical path from go live into success, into that value creation, that's all about changing behaviors, all about transforming the organization and getting not just an individual to use the system, but teams and individuals to collaborate effectively and to work through that. So, you know, if you look at the critical path to success, there's absolutely no way to achieve it if you don't get that adoption going. And that we have, you know, 20, 30, 40 years of IT failures in history where they didn't achieve those business results, not because the technology didn't work, but because people didn't work with the technology. You've got to have it there. So I think that's you know, one more thing is that people are really starting to wake up that we're not going to achieve what we need. And as a SaaS vendor, our customers won't get the value they need to renew. So let's really make sure we're driving the need for this home.
This next question I'm going to pose back to you, Jason. I think one of the kind of listeners sent it in beforehand, or a version of it, is what are your thoughts on how and if change management should be incorporated into our onboarding process? So we've kind of set the scene as to the need for it, but how would you do it? And our organization's starting to do it.
I think traditionally it's not been done, which is a real challenge, you know, and it really needs to be. So it'd be great if organizations realize that. But I think part of the challenge here is, as a vendor and a service provider, you need to understand what the adoption and change efforts need to be, and then really start to educate your customers all the way through the sales process, right up front, and through the onboarding process about their need to do it. You know, when we see organizations that if they're just talking training at go live, and if you start to hear the words, oh, we just need to sell people on the users and tell them what's in it for me, that's really not going to cut it. And those are some warning signs that you've got a lot more work to do. So I urge people to be really careful with that piece. But then also going through and just asking who's accountable for making sure that this adoption and this change happens, and tell me about their background, tell me about their experiences and their expertise. Tell me about the resources that they have available to them. Are they able to be successful here? And if they're not, what can you as a vendor do to help enable them to be successful? And what resources can you bring in, or even just highlight to them and say, hey, the person that you have in this role probably doesn't have everything they need to execute it successfully. Let's make some shifts here. So I think that's you know, one thing. Anything else you want to add to that?
I think we've kind of covered the key things, and I think absolutely change management needs to be something that you think about. And whether you look at your existing team upskilling, getting that kind of background as to what they can do. There are some great training courses, certifications you can do around change management, but start that thinking about how do we bring change management into this, and what does it mean for the way we deliver it. So I think that's super critical, and really kick it off from that initial engagement. Talk to the right stakeholders about this being about organizational change.
Agreed. So, you know, Jason, I'm wondering as well too, we've often talked with folks and we've been asked, do you implement a success brief during the onboarding process, and what programs you use to create it so it's not so manual, and how do you start to address it?
I'd almost, my kind of take on this is introduce the success brief or kind of a success plan even earlier in the process. So we're a big believer in making sure that your sales team can capture what the outcomes are. Those outcomes then fundamentally create your success brief. So what I really wouldn't want to do is in my onboarding, start asking my customers the question there as to what are they hoping to achieve from this? What are the outcomes they're expecting? We should already know that. I think what we should do worst case is just articulate it back in a very quick, succinct way, but don't use the onboarding process to start articulating what success looks like. We should come into this knowing, and the key thing in the onboarding process is really to verify what it is. So at the start of that customer journey that you've had your CS team involved in the last parts of the sales process, start documenting not just what the success goals are, what the outcomes expected, what the level of experience the customers want, but what we and what the customers need to do to achieve it. So start building out a plan from that. But then also what customers need to do internally. How can they achieve this? What are the changes that they need to be aware of? In terms of programs that we've used to create it so it's not manual, what we don't want to do in these webinars is really kind of make any references or recommendations to tools and technologies. Just try and keep it as kind of neutral as we can. But there are lots of tools out there that you can use to capture this and really capture those briefs really neatly. There are a lot of tools focused around project management, task management. And I think if you can capture your overall project outcomes, your project goals, your customer outcomes, it's kind of the overall arching goals, you can then break that down into a lot more kind of succinct, smaller steps that are more consumable, and you can then build into a broader plan. So I think absolutely implement the success brief, but do it as early as you can. I really, for me, if you only start thinking about it during the onboarding process, it's too late. Really start doing it as early as you can. I don't know if there's anything you'd add to that.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you just said. One other approach instead of just a brief has also been doing a success workshop right up front. And we facilitated this kind of thing where you can get the vendor in the room and you can get the buyer in the room, walk through some of these big concepts, but make it very specific to the buyer to really help them map out what is success, but also what do they need to do to achieve it, and then what can the vendor do. And by having both parties in the room for these facilitated sessions, you get some great ahas on both sides of the fence, and it also helps build the relationships that they need to establish trust and go forward. So, one of the things from an adoption and or change perspective, how you get there matters. And it's not about how quickly you get to the answer and how you check in the box that we wrote this down and we shared a document and we automated it. It's about how quickly you get the ahas that people need and get them to shift their behavior. So, if doing something a little bit more manual and interactive up front saves you, hours and hours and hours of fighting and controversy on the back end, it's totally worth it. We've had really great results with that.
Absolutely. We've had a number of questions in from you guys, from the listeners ahead of time. What Jason and I will do now is go through those. If you've got any more questions, please do post them in the chat window. There, we will do our best to answer them there. There's a number that we'll go through here. And similar, we'll bounce ideas off each other. But really, what we'd love to do, if there are questions that we can't answer now, we will look to cover them in a separate blog, a separate session. So please, if we've kind of struck a chord with you with anything that works, doesn't work, you disagree, agree, please let us know. We'd love your feedback. I'll pose the first question back to you, Jason. How do you successfully make the organizational shift from professional services to onboarding?
Yeah, and with that one, I wasn't entirely sure how to interpret that, but what I took it to mean is sort of how would they start moving away from professional services and more, this is an automated activity and this is just something to incorporate. But I think you need to flip this around where, there's so many professional services that need to happen under customer success already and under that umbrella. Onboarding is one step of it, and having the expertise to do that. So you may or may not charge for it. That's up to you and your finance model. But you really do need to start to think through that there is a lot of professional expertise to help navigate and guide this change during the onboarding process. And it's not just about getting the system live and not having just your technical implementation team, but having your adoption expertise and that professional service right up front. And there may be some things that you're doing in parallel with the technical onboarding. That's great. And I've done those projects very, very effectively. But we have some great examples where the onboarding function actually does provide additional services, training and consulting and this ongoing change and setting organizations up for success. And it really, I think, is a great way to go. Jason, how would you reduce the time it takes a customer to implement a new software?
That's such a great question, isn't it? It's if I had the answer to that, I think we'd be significantly wealthy. And I think the key thing to remember here is there is implementation, as we've talked about. The implementation time is only one part of the puzzle, and the solution really is to think about the time between signature and go live. So, and that go live then from go live to time to value. And go live, quite often there's too much emphasis put on that, too much focus on it. But it's the piece after go live, as you talked through on the slides there, Jason, was more critical. That what happens next in terms of user adoption engagement. I think if I look specifically at implementation time, so bringing the question back, I think some ideas there that you can look to reduce that time frame, and clearly there is a big benefit to reducing that. We want the whole journey to reduce as quickly as you can, but make sure that you've captured your customer outcomes correctly and as upfront as you can do. Make sure they're documented, played back to the customer, you articulate them, everybody's bought into them, your sales team understood what they are, you delivering them understands what they are. Make sure also that you understand your customers' needs and the challenges, but then also what the expectations are from them. What are their expectations as to the impact this is going to have on their day-to-day use, or on their daily work life? What are their expectations around how you're going to interact with them, how they're going to interact with the technology, and also what are their extractions and expectations around the timings? I think really the key thing though is to look at your processes within your onboarding function, and how can you make those, and where they've succeeded, how do you take those and take what's good and create it so that it's a replicable, repeatable, systematic process. So you take what we know works, package that up, keep refining it. I think with onboarding, it is an ongoing service improvement. We want to continually improve it. But when it works, package it up, document it, understand what those processes are, build automation in at the right points. You can build technology in. I think a lot of the data, there's a question at the beginning about customer data and capturing that. There are ways to capture customer data more effectively. And I think that's so critical to do that. And I think really we've said already, but shift your thinking from just being about the go live. And go live is that first key milestone, but you also want to understand more about your customer success when they're going to start going up that next curve, getting towards time to value. And once you can articulate that, you talked earlier on about presenting a plan back to them. I think that plan, being able to see it visually, what the expectations are, what the processes are, what the interactions will really help and reduce that time there. Was there anything else that you could add there?
Yeah, the only thing I would add as well, because I agree with everything you said, is that with some projects we've been on, if it's a very long implementation time, like major CRMs, ERPs, where it's going to be a multi-year rollout kind of thing, there may very well be some organizational behavioral changes that you can decouple from the technology go live and actually bring forward. So if there are new performance expectations, performance measures, if there are going to be some new quality checks or new internal processes that are not directly reliant on the system going live, any of those that you can bring forward can do two things. One, can start to accelerate your time to value because you've implemented them earlier. And two, it can reduce some of the change overload that happens and people inevitably, wanting to finger point at the system and blaming the system for things that it's not its fault. So really try to decouple those system behavior change and order changes from the go live is key. And then the flip side, I think, is many times, especially now with a lot of SaaS software that's used by a smaller group, it can go live faster than people can adopt it and adapt to it. If that's the case, great, go live with it really quickly and then figure out what are the adoption activities that in the perfect world you would do up front, but then you've got to add back in some form or fashion to accelerate the adoption afterwards. So not having a one-size-fits-all change in adoption approach, I think, is pretty key.
I think that's so critical. Just a quick time check, guys. We've got 10 minutes left. There are two more questions, and then we'll wrap up after that. And this next one, I think, is a really big one. I'm going to post it back to you, Jason. How do you quantify whether your onboarding has been done correctly, successfully? How do you measure the success of your onboarding?
Wow. Yeah, that's always a challenge, and people are always rushing to quantify. And I think there's certain things that you can look at. To your point, once you've identified the scalable, repeatable activities and creating some benchmarks around those, you can obviously track have those been done and where they need to go. But there's also sometimes a rush to do things fast and check the box as opposed to have it be effective. So you've got to be careful with that and saying yes, what was the impact there? So having that is really a good way. Understanding the customer's needs, and if you've identified them and documented and got them to agree to them and also agree that, yes, these are still the needs and the goals is very important. Because if you don't have that right up front, you're really there. You're going to be in trouble from the very, very, very beginning. But then really start to think about what you talked about is how we're going to capture that time to value for the customers and when they start to achieve success, how we articulate that. And will it be quantitative and maybe even qualitative pieces? And I've done both effectively, but really having some way to measure the business impact, because ultimately that's what you're trying to get to. I think those are all pretty good things. One of the easiest ways to go is when you're working with a customer, just ask them, how will we know when you've achieved this goal? How will you know that you're successful? And what they're also trying to tell you through that is, this is some of the things I'll be looking at when I make my renewal decision. So just ask. And I think those are some pretty easy things to do, but it's not the most perfect answer in the world, I don't think. Anything you'd add there?
I think it's a really difficult one to answer, really. And I think you've covered some of the key points. And you've got to understand what the outcomes are. You've got to look at the different milestones. So you've got the go live, which I think is quite easy to measure that, or it's easier. But the key thing is exactly as you said, it's how do you map your customer success outcomes, the customer's outcomes, what we've delivered versus what they've actually achieved. And that's the key thing. And quite often, one of the challenges that some of those outcomes don't occur until further down the line. Mm-hmm. And I think you've got to look at particularly long timescales there. But then you can start bringing in your kind of quarterly business reviews, or as I like to call them, your customer value reviews. As part of those, make sure that you are tracking and delivering that. And ultimately, your kind of first engagement with your success team is understanding, have we met the outcomes you expected from onboarding? And almost ask the question, be very upfront about it.
That's great. Absolutely. So Jason, the question for you is, have you had any challenges between sales and customer success when it comes to onboarding?
I think in a very short answer, yes. And I think it's a superb question. I'd really encourage our listeners to go back and listen to the podcast that we did back in January last month on sales and customer success alignment. Just some of the typical challenges. And Jason and I talked about this at length, and we've seen multiple instances of these. I think it's misaligned customer expectations. So customers expecting something very different to what's actually being delivered. That being sold on a promise that you can't deliver on is a big one that comes up time and time again. I think another one is customers understanding what customer success is, what we do, what the function is, where customer success is involved in the different points of the customer journey, how different customer success is to account management, how different it is to professional services, how different it is to sales, and that's really critical. So I'm a big believer, and as part of your sales pitch is introduce your customer success function there. It's a big sell. Talk to your customers about what we're going to do, and there's someone there responsible for ensuring they're getting the values they want, they're getting the outcomes that they want, and we're driving adoption with them. That's really critical. I think kind of alongside the misaligned customer expectation is a misunderstanding of what the customer's outcomes were. It's only recently, I think, that sales organizations have started looking more at outcomes as opposed to plain and simple objectives and goals. I think it's a very different shift, but I'm beginning to see it happen. So I think it's really important to get alignment there. I think at times as well, you do get gaps in product. We all know that products have got bugs in them. It might not be as mature as we wanted it to be. And I think on that, you've got to be very transparent with your customers. If something doesn't work, tell them what the plan is to fix it. Be very upfront about what your plans are and when you're going to implement these fixes and how you're going to do that. I think another key one is when there's, and we talked about this at length last month, is when the handover is literally a chuck it over the fence. We talked last month about the idea of a hand overlap. It's a process. It isn't just a document you pass over. You have to have a lot of buy-in, a lot of involvement. I want my salespeople involved in onboarding in the initial part of it. I want my onboarding or CS people involved in this last part of the sell. So there's a seamless transfer of knowledge and trust with who they are there. And I think there's so much more around this. I really, we talked a lot about this last month. Like I said, I don't like the idea of handover. Think more hand overlap. It's a crossover there. And I'm a really big believer in having, particularly for your larger enterprise organizations, clearly you can't do it for every organization, particularly when you look at the different segments you've got. But for your big enterprise organizations, bring in the relevant customer success manager. You may have a strategic customer success manager. Bring them into the closing stages of the sales cycle. Right? And then when you start your onboarding process, you're bringing in your senior customer stakeholders. Have your salesperson there as well. They've got that relationship. They can quickly outline what the expectations are, what the delivery is. And I think that really sets you up for success. It's a really nice way to start. You've got all the stakeholders, all the different people in attendance there. And it really does help build that trust and ensure better continuity, which I've seen great benefits from. Anything else you'd like to add there? And that was the very last question as well, folks.
Well, we do have a couple that have come in live that we might be able to get to real quick. No, I agree with everything you said. And for folks who are looking for that previous recorded one about sales and CS alignment, if you go to the main Tritons registration page for the Jason, so it's under the resources tab or tritons.co/Jasons. If you scroll to the bottom, you'll see all the replays and links to the podcast, so you'll be able to get that. It's we appreciate if you go check it out. Real quick though, I think in the last couple minutes that we have, one of the questions was, how can we really like the slide that we showed? How can we move people to focus on the post-live value when most people seem to focus on the cost to go live? You know, and just a couple things that come to mind real quick on that one. One, you know, we've asked chief financial officers, the first question, you know, what level of adoption are you assuming on day one with your user base, and how does it change your business case if you assume less than 100% adoption? One of the other things I would love to see more buyers of software do, and as a customer success team, you could even suggest to a prospect, or as a sales team, suggest to a prospect that, you know, it doesn't matter if you buy our software or someone else, you've got to do this work. And as a buying organization, you should not approve the purchase of any single software if you don't have a plan for how you're going to drive adoption and get your value out of it. So don't spend money investing in something unless you know you're going to be able to get the return that you want on it. Figure out what it takes to do that. What are the resources you need? What are the expertise? What's the time frame? And how do you make sure you have all that factored in? And if people start to think about that, then they're going to start to say, yeah, that makes sense. And if that's part of our natural course of doing business with every application, one, will be more effective, but two, we'll have a better sense of, is this really going to be successful for us? One other thought that comes to mind that we've seen is, how do you get people to report up the adoption and outcomes that they want on a regular basis as high as possible in the organization? Maybe it's the CEO, if it's a major investment for an organization, maybe it's even the board of directors, and making regular reports so that they have a reason to achieve the goals that they want, and to get people to focus on that outcomes as opposed to the cost. So those are a couple things. Jason, other thoughts on that?
I'd really reiterate what you said. I think it's so important to kind of get that buy-in there and that agreement from the stakeholders. And we've talked about it, I think, in depth, but really you need that buy-in across the board. This isn't just about the users. It's not just about the senior stakeholders. It's about everybody getting that buy-in and engagement.
Agreed. And then our last question, if you want to take a crack at this, how do you thoroughly assess the capacity of adoption during the pre-boarding or onboarding phase? Is there like a checklist or something?
I think it's a great question there. And I think you've got to look at kind of the scale of the organization, the scale of the implementation you are doing. So understand how big the size of this customer is, what's the revenue, the value of the customer, what are the kind of expectations for numbers of users, the amount of training you're going to do. Look at all of that, build it into your plan. I think you need to be very conscious as a vendor, a technology provider, as to what resources you have. Is it a sizable account that you can put one person doing the implementation? Do you need multiple people? I think there's a lot of effort placed on the human side of it, and using people-to-people training. That there are some self-service options you can do, as we've done here. You can record training sessions. Quite often people prefer very small consumable chunks of lessons for training. So look at different ways of doing that. And I think there's some really key things there, but it's all for me, you do get very different scales of projects you can do the onboarding for. So you've got to look at what the expectations are, timings, how does it fit in, but build a really solid plan around it. I think be very conscious that you may need additional resources on yourself. This might be more than one specific person there doing it. It might need a team. You might need to go on site with the customer. Something else I'd always kind of reiterate the need for is make sure you're working across your own business, across the different functions, so that people know what it is you're doing and know what the expectations are, rather than just look in isolation. This is just the responsibility of onboarding. No one else is involved. So do bring in other help when you need to. So I think I wouldn't call it a checklist as such, but I'd really, as part of the kind of gathering of that data up front from your sales and that initial onboarding, understand the scope of what you're doing and make an assessment internally as to the capacity that you need to do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, we've done a lot of these assessments with organizations, and they tend to be labor intensive for the most part. If it's a large organization that's very complex, we go through, and sort of part of the methodology is you want to triangulate. So get information at 3 different levels in the organization, from executive, manager, and frontline staff, as well as 3 different sources. So there might be interviews or focus groups or document reviews or looking at where things are. And when we go through and do this, it's sort of looking at what are the barriers that will prevent people from adopting software, even if they want to. And there's always some sort of organizational component outside of their control that prevents adoption. And then also, what are the drivers? What are the things that are motivating them, that are exciting them, that are enabling their success? And it's quite a bit of work to figure this out and to do that. But once you've done it a few times, you start to see the patterns and the commonalities. You can spot some challenges pretty quickly and figure out where you need to do a deep dive and where you don't. You know, during some of the training courses that we provide, we go into some of the advanced skills and go through, like, here's an example of the interviews, questions that we ask, because the questions matter and where we need to go. So it's a complex piece that's not easy to do, and it's not easy to do quickly, but once you figure it out and once you've learned how, it makes a lot of sense, and it's pretty easy to go forward. So I think that's all we have time for today. Really excited about this. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We have another episode of the Jason's Take On coming up in March. So you can go ahead, and registration is open for that now, as well as for the April one. And we'll be posting a few more registrations very, very soon. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope everyone enjoyed this. Jason, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, guys, we really, this for Jason and I, we really do. There's a lot of prep we do for this, but we really thoroughly enjoy this. It's a great conversation. There's a lot of experience that we want to give back and reflect on. So thank you very much for listening. It's great to see the registration and attendee numbers going up quite significantly. So really excited about the ones we've upcoming. And do reach out to me. As I said, I'm based over here in Europe. For any mentoring, consulting, and coaching, do link with me. My kind of beautiful pictures there, but reach out to me on LinkedIn. Send me an email. I'd love conversations. And it is, as I said at the beginning, the customer success community, it is such a powerful thing. And it's just the willingness to share and talk about best practice challenges. So please, please, please do reach out to me. I'd love a coffee, one-on-one conversation with anybody.
Yeah, I would as well too. You've got my contact information here, based in Washington, D.C. Actively reaching out and building my network on LinkedIn, and actually love to speak and connect with people. So it's always great fun to make introductions. So please don't be shy. And if you do want help with any of this information, TriTuns does offer a variety of training consulting services, as does Jason. So by all means, give us a shout, check it out. Always happy to lend a hand. And we hope you can join us next time. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks very much.